to get us going, I want to introduce Professor Kempster. Now, Steve and I, we've known each other for, goes back in the 90s. And we've worked together on all kinds of stuff, on research, mostly teaching, in fact, and mostly in executive education on this topic. Steve is the author of Good Dividends, Responsible Business for Business Purpose, and a whole lot of articles in academic journals. So he's a prolific writer and researcher, and often doing that with interviewing and going deep dive with owners and managers to understand how they do their business. We'll get into it in a minute and how we have this conversation around capitals. But one thing that has been very clear to me as I've observed Steve is that he has a lot to say about the why all this is important, but then goes on to the how. Okay, so the Good Dividends is a theory of change, as well as a model, as well as tools with a process. So we don't have to get stuck of just sort of complaining about the way things are. So that'll be very helpful and instructive to all of us. We do have a couple of slides really just to provoke conversation, not to be, a trainer. Now, earlier in the week, Monday, I was the lecturer and Steve was the commentator. So we flipped roles today so we can toggle back and forth a little bit. With that as an intro, Steve, thanks so much for being with us. And in about, I think about 30 minutes from now, we'll go into breakouts of about 4, and we've got a question we'd like you to wrestle with for a little bit. So this preliminary part is really just a conversation for us. Steve, over to you. I can bring up shall I bring up a slide?
Please bring up the slides, yeah.
Okay, good. Let's see.
So as Randall brings up the slide, hello everybody. As an ally, it's a wonderful thing to be part of this roundtable conversation. So we went through literally all the clips on the website. They were very inspiring, and I'm hoping that something that we're going to be talking about in the next 20-30 minutes captures the essence of those videos. So we're looking at capitals in a regenerative economy, and in particular, we're going to try and see how that can deal with the thorny issue of growth. Now, I was going to provocatively say, I'm going to say a few provocative things. Randall's budgeted me 5 minutes for my life work here. And so I'm reminded of an English proverb, sleep quick, we need the bed. So I'm going to go as quick and as succinct as I can. But the big issue is, what is good growth? How do we create good growth? I think all of us on the call today totally get the necessity that we need to change the way we understand growth. We don't have time, or perhaps we do in the conversations to come later, about, well, can we live without growth? My view, for what it's worth, is no, absolutely fundamentally not. But we can get into a conversation about that. So I'm going to move us to what then is good growth. So to get us all onto the same page, broadly, and I'm not an economist, I'm a leadership scholar, but broadly, growth is seen through an economic lens as a sort of function of combining capitals to create production, distribution, and consumption. I think we all get that. And the sort of GDP per capita is the problematic way that we keep measuring this notion of growth. So what we're going to put out now is a sort of a stake in the ground to say, well, what would good growth be? So it must be, as a fundamental, and donut economics gives us a really good insight to this, as a minimum of enhancing human well-being, advancing humanity, and enhancing sustainable ecosystems. So I think we'd all buy that. So that is what growth must give us. But at the same time, and in a complementary fashion, we've got enhancing value to stakeholders. And we've got a whole collection of stakeholders there. So that is the sort of essence we're going to say. How can capitals come together and create good growth rather than the problematic situation of growth that we see through capitals and capitalism thus far? Okay, we'll just slip over to the next slide, Randall. So what we're looking at here, and I'm reminded of, my son said to me, he was 24, 25 at the time, he's a biologist now, worked at Plant Impact. His PhD was all about how nitrogen fixation can occur better through natural hormone than artificial fertilizers. And it's a fantastic bit of research, which I think from a regenerative agricultural basis, there's much to be had. Anyway, he said to me, surely this is common sense. Isn't, because my argument to him was multi-capitals is what an organization is about, and how can sets of capitals, including the planet, including communities and society, be integrated into the business model. And I unpacked this little model you're seeing in front of you. And he said, isn't this just common sense? How can it be these really sophisticated people that run businesses don't maximize all their capitals? So that was his line back to me. And it was, sort of makes you stand up and think again, as I did a little bit more, that I need to articulate it in perhaps a better way. But if we are seeing this model, and I'll unpack it briefly, if we're seeing this model as obvious common sense, that's a really good thing. So if it resonates on the basis, well, we know all this, we know that all these capitals exist, well, of course we do. So the good dividends model draws in what we know. We know that there are multi-capitals. However, the way that organizations, the way that businesses conceive, the way that our society, the way that our economics, the way that our politics broadly sees businesses is through the financial capital lens. There are debates, and I've spoken to hundreds of managers, and they totally get multi-capitals, yet they don't integrate, they don't think about how multi-capitals can come forward and generate dividends that can create great benefit for the business. And they deeply don't understand predominantly how a multi-capital business could in fact enhance society and at the same time create value for the business. And in lots of conversations, I've tried to tease this out, but in simple form, the model seeks to say there are 6 capitals, which each is a dividend, each providing a yield, a benefit, a return to the other. They systematically and systemically integrate together and produce greater returns. And at the heart of this is to say that natural social capital, which is often referred to in literature, we call it planet community capital and planet community dividend, can be brought right into the heart of the business model. It creates value, creates a dividend into human capital, creates employee engagement by seeing a line of sight to purpose, creates meaningful work, creates employee engagement. Now, what we know is that the relationship between employee engagement is so strongly correlated to innovation, to productivity, to quality, to customer service. And of course, we know, dropping around these arrows, that innovation it yields greater operational productivity. And we know that operational productivity and quality yields greater customer satisfaction and service. So reputational capital is enhanced. And we know that reputational capital enhanced and operational capital enhanced, we overwhelmingly know this, leads to financial capital advancement and greater dividends. So we know that. The issue is how within organizations can we bring this to the fore? Can it shape overarching purpose, strategy, KPIs, and a broader sense of tracking that through time? It creates an opportunity and a model to begin to say something around how growth can occur. Now I'm going to flip on to the last slide, Randall, if I've still got any minutes left of my 5, and someone will shout to me if I haven't, is that this is just a provocative framework, just perhaps to stimulate our conversations. So right at the heart of this, I'm placing this notion of good growth through interconnecting integrative capitals, including planet community. At the outer regions, the north-south, we've got Kate Raworth's donut economics, always lowering maximum ecological concerns, whilst at the same time continually raising minimum life essentials. How do we enhance humanity and enrich our ecosystem? And at the west and the east, We've got circular economy, which many of us on this call will have a deep understanding and are practicing and exploring. That needs to be reinforced and grown stronger and interconnected to maximizing those capitals. And I think the secret sauce for me is social innovation and how that needs to flourish out and reinforce those capitals and achieve those lowering ecological concerns and continually raising maximum life. I get that all the pictures have come back to me, all the lovely faces. My time is out. Randall, over to you.
Well, your time's not out. It's just up for all of us now to engage on that. Hopefully that provokes some thoughts, some ideas that you'd like to share. I see one from Marcella. I'll read that out in a second. Again, we've got about probably another 20 minutes, and then we'll go into some breakouts to wrestle with this, how you've seen capitals at play in any businesses that you've been involved with. Marcella, why don't you go ahead and just unmute, please, and bring your thoughts forward, please.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I completely agree with you, Steve, and that's why I went into business, because there was a possibility to look at a business holistically. However, there is a huge tension between when you go to the point of raising capital, even with impact investors, they expect an outsized one side of the 5 returns and to the sacrifice of the others. How would you, how could one overcome those challenges?
Yes, so there is a very understandable, and I've heard the refrain many a time, of a trade-off between focusing on investing in certain capitals and others falling back. Now, we've got some research. We had a PhD student who's been working with us on the Good Governance Project now for about 3.5 years. There's a paper under review at the moment, and it shows the correlations between them are striking. And we are tracking value generation. So at the moment on our research project, we have anecdotal evidence that it's not a trade-off. They are stimulating, and there's a reciprocal relationship that goes on. We know that practices, that's what the research paper looks at, is that where the practices work on all 6 of those areas, they are seeing benefits. And we're now tracking value being produced. So they are measuring KPIs that are going on in all areas. So to begin to produce the research evidence to respond to just that great point, that we're not, by investing in people, you don't disinvest in the financial returns. Potentially, of course, in the very short term, it's an argument that has to be persuaded, because you are distracting from a different norm of where your investments are going. But what we are looking at, and we've got anecdotal evidence that by investing in human capital, so you see a greater return. One of my colleagues, Anthony Hesketh, who's part of the project in the book, has examined the S&P 500 and looked at those organizations that talk about their investment in people and measuring and track it and report on it. And then he maps that to their performance and their alpha in the index, and they outperform the market. So we have these various evidences that it doesn't need to be a trade-off. What we need to do is have a clearer, more explicit evidence base where we can go to such discourses and say there is a different way of seeing these multi-capitals and the systemic relationship. Does that sort of answer your question, Marcella?
That was from Marcella, yeah, and
Marcella?
she submitted her thesis to her master's degree at Cambridge on this very topic last week, and so
well, good luck with that.
Congratulations on that, yeah, and she's leading an amazing business in the food sector and food systems space. Now you mentioned the book, and I gave my copy to Benoit, who's on. So I would show the book here as a promo, but maybe Benoit, there you go, you've got it yourself. So good dividends for responsible leadership for business purpose. In it is some description of tools, and I'd like to have Giles come on in just a second, bring out your comment a little more. We didn't go at all into tools, but there are about 7 that we have. And because you mentioned Anthony Hesketh's work on value, I think one question we shouldn't leave here with is how can we realize value from any of this? I mean, real value for the business. And I've got some thoughts on this, and it's where sprint projects come in as a real practical initiative that we can employ beyond the theory, but maybe that comes a little bit later. Giles, why don't you bring out your comments a little bit?
Sure, yeah, and thank you for a really nice talk. It's the same question effectively about investment and getting returns on investment, but within companies. So when you have to convince people within an organization that we should back training, we should back this kind of investment, we should spend some time or money, resources, I guess the same answer about the evidence base is needed, but are there also any good practical methods that you can use to help people move from the old way of decision making to a more inclusive, more sensitive way, and thereby get returns?
Yeah,
Any tips?
It's a really good point. So in the work that I've done with organizations, and I was mulling through trying to work out, so how many people have I worked with for the last 3 or 4 years trying to tease these things out? And actually it comes to around, which was a sort of pleasing number, around 200 different managers in different organizations and what they're trying to do. And I'm probably going to make loads of enemies at this moment as I say this, but it's non-managers who get it more than managers do. It's almost managers in their frame of thinking find it problematic in the way that they chunk things down and the way that they've historically seen KPIs. As soon as, and this comes from feedback I've had from people I've worked with, soon as the managers are engaging with employees and exploring the opportunities. So for example, making the link between planet community, natural social capital, and human capital. So having the conversation about what is the purpose to work, and teasing out that really difficult space to get into. Other research I've done says this is a really problematic area. But when they start trying to articulate the line of sight between everyday work and the purpose of the business, the employees start gathering examples. They start showing opportunities. They start bringing out evidence of things that excite them. And it becomes a moment to suddenly see that we could do more with regard to our purpose by engaging with the employees. And the employees then see the opportunities and the things that flow. So in some respects, inside the business, a managerial mindset, which, whether we like it or not, is dominated by neoliberal thinking, has sort of framed almost a belief system, and therefore the idea of thinking multi-capitals and integrating them together and measuring them all and letting them all reciprocally flow is a problematic mindset. It's a bit like Plato's cave, stepping and is seeing something utterly different that you've never seen before, yet it's an obvious thing to many others. If it was obvious to a biologist at 24, 25, I would sort of voice, and if it's obvious to employees, what is it in our managerial mindset that sort of becomes a problematic dynamic? I think I've gone off and not quite answered your question, Giles, but
well, you mentioned purpose, Steve, and purpose had to come into it, and I'm thankful for you mentioning that, because purpose is absolutely key in all this and can be a part of opening up the sort of creativity and ideas from those all around the business at all levels. Harry, you make a great point. You can probably say it better than me reading your question. If you could bring that out, and then Michaela had a great point too on KPIs, and we've done a lot of work on balanced measures and metrics, so we want to talk about that a little bit too. But Harry, maybe first you can bring yours out.
Thanks, Randall. Yes, Steve, I loved your presentation, and I'm truly aware of the necessity of measuring both the input on the input side and the output and outcome side of the use of the different capitals. But actually, I was wondering, and I'm doing a lot of research with a lot of organizations, family businesses, small and medium enterprises, but also larger organizations. And what I'm currently concentrating on is the way that people interact. And that is sometimes very difficult to measure. And I fully agree with you that if you create a kind of humanity in your organization, involve your employees, etc., that ultimately leads to better results in the various capitals. But nevertheless, it is a value in itself, I would say, that people engage with each other, help each other out, and get fun from it. And it's sometimes very difficult to get that into KPI systems, etc. How do you measure that? What's your view on that?
Steve, let me put you on pause for a second. Steve, hold that thought, because it would be a little bit, I'd be remiss in not seizing that on a silver platter you gave us, Harry, in your question. How do we engage around the organization? Well, let's take that onto the table. Are there any other good examples or bad examples in organizations that any of us here in the room have come across where you've seen that really play out in a most positive way or negative way, engaging with others to make this real and bring momentum? Any thoughts? And then back to you, Steve, to give your thoughts. You just unmute, and then Monica, after that, we'll go to your question. Steve, why don't you pick that one up then?
Okay, so I think it's a really fundamental point. It's a little bit like why isn't an organization as a community a really joyous place to work day in, day out? What is it that intervenes into that gets in the way? And there's much I could talk. I could feel a sort of almost a Management 100 lecture about the nature of work and how we do things. And I think we all get the gist that in many of our experiences, it can be a very joyous, and often is. I think a fundamental connection is the relationship, leader-follower relationship. And what is the climate that those who are leading enable and embrace and encourage? There is a very strong relationship between leadership behavior and employee engagement. We know that there's a strong relationship between employee engagement and quality, productivity, and service. Equally, there's a very strong relationship. And in our research, we can see where responsible leadership is very strong. We see that human capital is increased, that employee engagement. So we know that, and other researchers show it, that you cannot really separate the climate from leadership. It's a bit like saying culture and leadership are two sides of the same coin. They are. But climate is something much more grabbable. It's much more immediate. You can have the climate in a team. You can have culture and organization, can't do much about it, but your team, your department, the climate, the atmosphere, the exploring, the discovery, the excitement, that can be stimulated by the way that we're encouraged, rewarded, and things that we're praised for. So a simple answer, as a leadership scholar, I come back to leadership, Harry. What do you think?
Yeah, I truly agree on that. And basically also to underline that leadership is not simply the leadership only by management. Leadership can be found in the entire organization. What leadership actually requires at this point in time, I would say, is the creation of that climate, of structures, of decision-making processes in which people can actually contribute to their joint well-being.
Yeah, well said.
Great, thank you, Harry and Steve. Monica, you've got your hands up. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, Steve. Very interesting. Yeah, my question is more, maybe myself, I've been more looking at how do we finance large projects, like infrastructure systems for developing countries, and which are crucial, for that good growth or regenerative growth. But in that context, every investment has to be, bankable or viable to happen. So the financial lens, and whether the group that we do it is credit worthy. The whole system will force maybe a way in which maybe communities will lose the ownership of the land because somebody else would be more credit worthy as a person. I was wondering, I know maybe some large corporates it's an issue of leadership and they could in a way set out their own rules. But when we're talking like a small companies and places where the access to capital is the thing that dictates the rules, which changes do you think are needed in that financial sector so that people could actually use these good dividends system even when they are not that powerful?
Thank you, Monica. Steve can give a reflection on that. And then maybe to follow you up, Steve, if we could, I'll share a slide for 1 minute on the tools, and we could just quickly go through the toolbox, could be helpful.
Okay, so that's another real testing question. All that I'm saying, even when we talk about growth, is a highly problematic and complex issue. And I'm overly simplifying and potentially on the border of simplisms. So whatever I say needs to be taken in that way. it's interesting. What are the returns on the investment that people are seeking, and how are they seen in a broader systemic way? So I could imagine immediately what would be the return on the investment that people are looking for to finance that, and how does it balance out? Do we look at, from a multi-capital's point of view, how the value being generated to a broader set of stakeholders will enrich that return on the investment? And so the tools and the instruments on finance are really explicit on return on equity, return on assets, and what you'd be working on there. But to what extent do we balance that with other value generations that will have a reciprocal effect over the medium to long term that would advance that return on the investment? So I think my short answer is that it's the time frame, the temporal perspective. On what basis is the return to be given? Is the return in the short term? Therefore, we're looking at the ROI, and what will that occur in a purely financial sense? Or are we looking at the ROI as a financial return over the long term? And if we're doing that, then we need the reciprocal value generation of all the capitals, which would then enhance the financial ROI. Bear in mind, I'm not an accountant, I'm a leadership scholar. I'm grappling at the edges of my knowledge here, but that's how I would view as a good dividends argument. There'd be more knowledgeable people in front of me who would give you a better answer, I think, than I've given.
Steve, let's do a real quick one on Christoph's question. Are managers taking on a wrong identity, beliefs? Well, I mean, if the organization's purpose, if they're aligned with that purpose, and the purpose is fully around broken capitalism, well, then they're taking on the right beliefs. At least it's aligned and coherent with the purpose. I think the question might be is, do we have the purpose and the culture and the climate that is aligned in a more regenerative way, and are they aligned with that? That's how I take a little bit of the question. Do you have a comment on that? And then I'll go to the toolbox.
I think my comment would be the fundamental mindset shift to embrace natural and social capital, to embrace planet community as part of the reason why the business exists, as a management shift in its mindset, rather than singularity, and the understandable singularity on fiduciary duty, to maximizing share owner return. The good dividends is trying to say that shareholder return probably has not been maximized over the medium to long term by minimizing the capital investment. So it's how can we get managers to see that the maximization of all capitals maximizes the shareholder return? That's a sort of judo effect. What I mean by that is using capitalism to change capitalism. How can we maximize shareholder return? Well, let's think it through in the good dividends basis. So I think there's a bigger issue around how we understand the role. I'll just throw this out, which might be provocative or not. What would happen if society got to the point where it said businesses will only have a license to operate if it can demonstrate regenerative capacity? So you will not be able to carry on producing shareholder return unless you can demonstrate greater value generation to society, to the ecology. And I don't think we're that far off. Maybe we're 10, 15, 20 years away from that, but certain societies, I think, are not going to let businesses operate on short-term managerial perspective to shareholder gain. Anyway,
yeah, regulation is on the rise. And so because regulation is on the rise, we need to be able to show what we're doing. And the toolbox you see in front of you does help in that regard. So the leadership mirror, we use that for Regenerative Alliance. If are those that would like to become an ally within the Alliance, a full member, they come through this process. Many of you recognize this, the leadership mirror tool, and that's something that Steve and I developed over the last years. The GD audit, if you are not feeling well, or if your car is not feeling well, you might go to the mechanic or your doctor, and they ask you questions. Where's the pain? There's a diagnostic. It helps you to look in the mirror as an organization, understand where are you, how are you doing across all of these capitals. And it's non-judgmental. It just simply reveals to you your level of engagement and impact in each of those capital areas. And then Steve, why don't you pick up 3 and 4 here on purpose and then house model?
So we've touched on purpose a number of times. It's hard to imagine how the good dividends would operate in the vacuum of absence of purpose. Purpose gives that sense of connection between the business activities and value we generate and the social impact and the environmental enhancement that we're seeking to do. So purpose is fundamental. So the tool takes people through. And this is a hugely problematic space. It's easy for academics to say we must have a grand vision and a purpose, and that will make the business palpably richer and better off. Easy to say. It's deeply problematic to get purpose alive for everyday businesses. And so what that tool does is works through in a sort of laddering basis to understand the relationship between purpose, vision, and the underpinning values that are associated with that. And then the house model particularly draws from lots of work that Randall's done, becomes an integrative tool that has purpose as the sort of peak of the roof of the house, so to speak, and then your strategies, your dividends, your value generations you're seeking to achieve. What are those strategic goals? And then sitting under that has key performance indicators that you'll be measuring that we capture further in our balance measures. And then sitting as the foundation, you have your values. So that's the house model and purpose. Do you want to pick up 5 and 6?
Yeah, sure. Value stream mapping, that's really about taking a lot from lean and taking out waste in the organization. Really, where are you finding value through the whole value chain of the organization by applying these principles. And then how we measure that is the KPIs and the metrics in a balanced way, drawing a little bit from balanced scorecard, but integrating into this. There was a question, great questions. Steve and I will go through them and maybe we'll put out a reply to all to address some of these questions that have come up. We don't have time to get to all of them, but how do sustainable development goals come into all of this? Well, there can be a mapping of sustainable SDGs into this clearly. And then lastly, all of that could be applied in a sprint project to if you're feeling that there's not a kind of a flow and an energy going through the organization to carry these things forward, it's probably because there isn't a process like the kind we've described, and things can get a bit stuck or a bit clunky. But we've seen over and over again, by applying this process, you can come and feel like you're really getting value from it. I'm going to take one last question from Marcella. I think you had a hand up, and then we'll go over to breakouts, and I'll put that question for the breakouts in the chat. Marcella.
So I'm having a conversation with Andrew Watson of Rethinking Capital around accounting principles. And I think we and others come to the conclusion we need to have not double entry bookkeeping, but quadruple entry, including negative and positive externalities. So we have to really count differently, have a new language of accounting that comes into the capital conversation. And part of this is also that when we account and measure, we generally, we always do it entity by entity. So Steve Kempster's accounts or Randall's accounts or Amazon's accounts. But actually, we should also do collective accounts. So what is Amazon plus its ecosystem? So this is really going beyond maybe the conversation now, but we need to get to the roots of the issue, which is how we measure, how we count, and only then the other forms of capital can be reflected in the new sort of accounting principles. So anyway, this is a really interesting conversation. And this morning, by the way, Germany announced that they are going to look seriously at beyond GDP to use other measures of accounting. So it also connects with the ecosystem accounts, not only the corporate level capitals, but also the societal capitals. So Steve, thank you very much. I'm just throwing it in for the sake of interest.
Great, thank you.
Just throw it back before Randall tells me to be quiet. I'll just say you must speak, Marcello, to Anthony Hesketh. I'll hook you up. The work he's done at Lancaster is right on this. For example, he makes the point, what happens if the balance sheet doesn't balance? So for example, human capital. And if the human capital increases and it's not on the balance sheet, how do we start accounting for human capital increasing? And then if you think about what would happen to managerial practices and KPIs if you started measuring whether human capital had decreased or increased through the leadership and development work and investment in people over a year. It would transform the way we understand and measure human capital, and that would transform employee engagement, and that would transform all those capitals. So just by homing in on that aspect, one alone, you get a revolution of thought. But we have to change the iron grid of the accounting procedures. So I couldn't agree more with you, Marcello.
So let me transform us into the breakouts now. Thank you for those great comments. And I'll put again in the chat the question that we'll be looking at. You can read that for yourself. Or, I mean, think about an organization you know well. Where are these capitals really integrated and measured well, and they're really being pursued with intentionality? And which capitals might be kind of on the fringe and not touched? Give yourself a little bit of diagnostic here. So that's the question. And let's go to breakouts now. See, it's about 7 minutes. We'll be back in session. Choose a moderator to guide the conversation. See you in about 7 minutes. So I hope you had a good conversation, and we've got a couple of minutes. Let's open floor, unmute, and throw out a couple of comments that may have come up in your conversation. Who would like to go?
I'll have a go. I just want to say, all of us who have met, we didn't finish our conversation. There's no reason not to connect afterwards or later to continue, because Jörg and Katrine and all that, we were right in it. So
us too.
This is not limited to that.
Yeah.
So please reach out.
Yeah, and in my group, I will go very fast. It was about human relations and bonds, new metrics, of course, but as well an input of Sophie is about coming from family businesses, is time, long-term perspective and purpose at the core, not short-term, long-term, strong relation with a purpose. This is what we have been discussing, and we had a great time, but too short.
Great, thank you. Dirk.
Sorry, you're putting me on the spot. I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think purpose resonates. And then, you know, we talked about the importance of having metrics that are actionable in organizations, and the need for not simplified but more simple models that allow for execution, like triple bottom line accounting, that are driven by purpose, that can be used as an accountability structure for operators in organizations. I think Randall and the rest of the group, anything?
Great, no, that was good. Another one from, Christoph. Yeah, go ahead, Christoph.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dirk.
And if I take in short, please tell me if I was right, but we think of returns very often, which is like what Randall would say in legacy context, you know, we give back later, but how can we get to relationships where we give first and not immediately look for return? Because that's building capital. So the abundance capacity in giving first, rather than waiting to give last or back later, is a good way to start thinking about this in a more identity perspective.
Provocative question, and probably one for another roundtable in the future. I'd like to start to move us toward the close now, and I want to say thank you to everybody for joining on the call today. For Christoph and for Josine for setting up the conversation and all the administration and coordination around that. For Steve, is Steve still on? There he is. I didn't see your picture hiding. Steve, before I go into that last phase and some feedback, Steve, what did your group talk about?
We had a really good conversation around libertarian perspectives and the broad notion of intervening or not intervening, about wealth, democratization of wealth, taxation of wealth, big conversations, huge issues. It was very stimulating indeed. That was roughly the conversation.
Great, thank you, thank you. Well, let's carry that on. Let's connect with each other. And certainly if you go to the Regenerative Alliance website, you'll see a range of experiences from the summit, which is happening in New York State in September, living experience. Benoit, can you share for about 15 seconds on the next living experience, please?
So June 16 to 18, Satish Kumar, that we met at the summit, and Jean-Paul Dossi in the most beautiful place of the world, Comer, in the Swiss Alps. with a group of very inspiring people. So the idea is really to go deep all together and enjoy the moment and get the energy of Satish and Jean-Paul. So
Right.
you will find information on the website. It's
Thank you, Benoit.
maximum 15 people.
Great, thank you. Christoph, 15 seconds on the next roundtable.
Well, the next roundtable, we're going to talk about regenerative brands and identities. And how can we not only get people to measure, but mobilize through that? Because maybe that's the piece that, we talk about returns, but reciprocity and reputations are built on identity. That's what we'll be talking about.
Great, thank you. And Josine, thank you for putting this in the chat and links to these activities. And of course, leader circles. And so Flory and myself have been driving this offering to those that become allies. And we're seeing from the feedback a lot of value gained from that. We've just launched another circle and more to come as more allies join. So thank you very much, Steve. I'm going to put in the chat now a link to one question. How would you rate this, our conversation? Was it relevant to you? Give it a 0. If it was relative to your relevant for your interests, give it a higher score. But there's a 3 seconds feedback form linked there. Do that now. I think it would be great. And Josine's going to put on some music, and then there's a couple other questions which ask, if we were to set up a new kind of conversation, which is probably a little bit less input and more around really just a bigger breakout with a smaller group of people, what themes would you like to discuss? If you could sit around the table with 5 people, go deep for about 45 minutes, what would that be? We call that a connector, and we're going to start to bring that up. We'd like to hear from you. What would you like to talk about in those? Okay, so that's right on the link. Click on that, and you can finish that in 2 minutes while we wrap up today. Again, huge thanks to Steve. Not enough time to go into all the depths and corners of what you brought to us on good growth, capitals, and dividends, and certainly not enough time for our conversations, but we try to be expeditious. I want to say thanks again to the team and to all of you, and wish you a great weekend.